Tonight our subject is courage and confidence. Every subject leads back to the same basic truths, but it's a very good way to sort of come at truth from many different angles. It's also true that each of us as individuals has different entanglements. And so we all sort of climb the mountain and we all meet certain briars and bushes and tests along the way. And the art of overcoming them to a certain extent is all the same. But sometimes it doesn't hurt to look at it from different angles. The question of courage and confidence is one that's actually been a particular personal battle of mine. I tend to tell the stories based on my own experience because that's how I've learned the lessons. I was always very school smart, is what I called it. For some reason, from past lives, I could always do well in school. And because of the way our society is structured, if you can do well in school, you're considered to be competent. And the expectation is that you will be successful. And people tend to actually think even that you're wise just because you're school smart. Of course, wisdom and intelligence are not the same thing. And I was always aware of the fact that despite the fact that I could excel by the only standards that were being applied, that in actual fact, I was absolutely confused and mystified and did not have any wisdom. Didn't really know what I was doing in life and how I was going to accomplish anything that was important to me. You may have heard me say my intuitive search was for happiness. I didn't get the word bliss or Satchit Ananda for many years, but I knew that's what I was looking for. And I knew that merely being smart in school was not necessarily going to give me anything that I wanted. So there was this strange reality, this dual reality going on even from a very young age of apparent competence and complete insecurity underneath it. And it was the pattern that I worked with for many years until I got to Swami Kriyananda. Now that I have a much greater understanding on the spiritual path, what are we trying to accomplish, Daya? Okay. Okay, thank you. That's all right.
You totally lose your train of thought.
Yeah, I just thought I would just give up my train of thought until we got it settled. That's all right. Better than my standing in the dark. I appreciate that. It's distressing when at the end they tell me, oh, we couldn't see and hear you the whole time, but we didn't want to interrupt you. Okay, great. And anyway, I was this strange combination of apparent competence and insecurity. And no amount of help from any external source or internal source until I got on the spiritual path was ever able to solve that for me. And even after it was a long struggle for many years until I got it figured out. But I also began to realize on the deepest possible level that of course we're insecure if our lives are not anchored in a greater reality. I mean, what could be less certain than the capacity of one ego to make this world conform to its desires? If we happen to have a positive karmic trajectory, we might get the impression that it will. But sooner or later, things happen in every life, and if it doesn't happen in your personal life, it often happens in the national life, the political structure, the economic structure, the international politics, all sorts of things. I had this experience in an American hospital. The husband of a devotee, and he was a sort of supportive of the spiritual path, but not formally on the path, although what I'm about to tell you tells me that he had actually a much deeper understanding. He just didn't like the form of things. He was a very strong man, extremely wealthy, very successful. He really enjoyed his life. He spent his money. He did exactly what he wanted to do. He had a fairly hedonistic approach to his life, but nonetheless, there he was. He was a strong athlete, but in one of his daily runs, his spine began to hurt. He had a backache. So he wasn't cured by the usual methods of massage or anything like that. He went to the hospital. They did a CT scan. He was absolutely riddled with cancer. And I mean, he discovered it by getting a backache when he was jogging miles a day. And it was immediately apparent that nothing could be done about it, and no treatments were possible. And it was of an advanced stage that in 2 weeks he was on life support. And then his wife knew, he had no children, his wife knew, everybody knew that he would have no interest in living that way. So strangely, at 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, he was going to die because they were going to, take out the breathing tube and just let him die. Well, they invited me to be there, which was a good idea. And they wanted me to do a ceremony after he passed and so on, so all of that was there. He'd been unconscious, but I arrived at 2:30 and he was fully wide awake and fully aware of what was going to happen and completely calm. He'd lived his life, he'd had a good life, he was grateful for it, he really loved his wife, and now it was over, and well, that was just going to be that. And at 3 o'clock, and as it got close to 3 o'clock, this is the part I wanted to talk to you about. I was comfortable with it. The wife was unhappy. He was perfectly fine. The most nervous people in the room were the doctors. Because the doctors, and I don't know if any of you are physicians, but the doctors were in charge of life and death. And of course they're not in charge of life and death, but they had persuaded themselves in the rather atheistic environment of this American hospital that they were in charge of life and death, but in fact here was death and they didn't have any idea what to do with it. So they absolutely insisted that he be given a strong dose of sedatives before they disconnected the life support. I tried, utterly in vain, to say, he's perfectly fine. He couldn't talk because he had a ventilator in his mouth. But I said, he's perfectly fine. There's not the slightest hint of agitation, and I couldn't begin to explain. Let him pass consciously, don't sedate his consciousness. Finally, I just thought it's not worth it. Just let it go. But it was fascinating to me to see how nervous and afraid those doctors were. Every day they have to deal with this. But then when I stood back and thought about it, I thought, they have no context in that environment. Absolutely no context. They are highly skilled, and I realized it was exactly the same syndrome I had lived with so much of my life, which is I have this enormous intelligence, this great training, this huge responsibility, and I'm perfectly conscious that I'm just a little speck, on this planet. And of course I'm nervous. Common sense would tell you that you have to be nervous. How can you possibly control all of this that's going on around you? The forces of karma, they didn't have any of that vocabulary. But what I have to start with is, I think it's impossible to have courage and confidence unless we really see ourselves in relation to the infinite. And the first step to being courageous and strong is to realize that we're just a leaf on the river. And we're just floating down the river, and where the river is going to take us and what's going to happen is so far out of our control that the more we can just relax and enjoy the ride, the more likely it is that the real power within us will come forth, because it will then be in some real relationship. Many years ago, when I was first married, I went through just the kind of thing that, I will just say women are inclined to go through, where I got myself emotionally upset over nothing in particular and got my feelings hurt, even though my dear husband had, in this particular case, was entirely innocent. He basically was just standing there being himself, and I kind of created an emotional storm around him. as women are inclined to do, with all due respect to my fellow women. And I didn't enjoy the experience, and I realized that now that I was married, had this close relationship with another person, I had opened myself up to having my happiness depend on his actions. So that wasn't really a very cheerful prospect for me. I was long since on the path. I married after I'd been at Ananda for more than a decade, and my husband is a devotee, and we do all this together. So my thought was, well, maybe I just won't be quite so open. I'll just close up my heart a little bit. That seems like a really good solution, doesn't it? And that way, you don't, if you're not open, you don't get hurt. You don't let people into your life. You're protected from what they do. I also had enough sense to realize that was not a really good plan, either for the success of the relationship I was in or as a way to deal with life. I had an experience, it was many years later, but it was highly related to this. I was in seclusion and I was meditating. And instead of thinking during that meditation of giving my consciousness to the divine, for some reason it occurred to me to try to receive Divine Mother's love into me. In the Bible, one of the most important phrases St. John says about Jesus, to all who received him, to them gave he the power to become the sons of God. Yogananda talks about it in terms of attunement, which is a two-way street. We give ourselves to the divine, and then the divine is able to come back to us. Otherwise, it doesn't work properly. So I was in this meditation, and I thought I would just open myself to Divine Mother's presence. And because I was sensitized, because I'd been alone for many days and was meditating a lot, I became very strongly aware of a kind of barrier that I had. I'll put my hand over my heart chakra because that's where I felt it. A barrier that I had erected over many incarnations. And it was exactly what I'm talking about, I thought about in my early years of being married, where painful things had happened to me over many incarnations, because painful things happen to us over many incarnations. And I had dealt with them by just hardening up a little. If we don't feel things so deeply, then we won't feel things so deeply. And also by just holding on a little bit to painful memories, to resentments, to the belief that I was treated unfairly and people ought to treat me different. These were not, in that meditation, past life memories. They were an awareness of a certain vibration of consciousness that was a vritti in my heart chakra that was vibrating at a rate that was not compatible with Divine Mother's love. And so Divine Mother's love wanted to come into me, but I had created a barrier of my own resistance to that kind of wholehearted, participation in life, acceptance of life, calm understanding of God's will for me. It was extremely important, that moment, because it helped me to understand what inhibits us in 1,000 ways. Now, going back to that experience I had with my husband, okay, I thought to myself, I don't want to harden my heart, because I know what that feels like. You see, you wall yourself in, you wall everyone else out. And bad things can't get in, but it also strongly limits the good things that can come in. You have just drawn a tighter circle again around your separate individuality, and that will never serve you in the long run. It seems like a good idea at the time. That's why we do it. They really don't appreciate me. I was really a true friend and they betrayed me, right? I really depended on that and I didn't get it. And it seems like a way to cope We cope by hardening like that, exactly, and by making the border a little bit more protected. And with my husband, I tried to think about his noble character, which in fact has been proven over time. I was very fortunate. And he is who I hoped he would be. 30 years later, you can declare that with confidence. 3 months in, you've got your fingers crossed, still like this. It turned out to be true. But even then, I thought, if my security is based on the fact that I don't have to be afraid of him doing anything bad, because he's not going to do anything bad, then still what I've done is maybe I've looped him into it, but it's still this world that I have to control. And it has to be controlled according to my own ideas of what it's supposed to be. Now it's even worse, speaking to the women in the room. Because now you have to make him behave, because if he doesn't behave, then you'll suffer. Right? It just didn't seem like a good idea to me. So I thought, what is the answer here? And the answer is obvious, but profoundly important. I realized that behind him is the presence of God and Guru. That everything that comes to us through this world and through other people, through your work, through your creative ideas, where is it coming from? It appears that it has all this form, but behind all that form, there's the divine force. And everything that's coming to us in this world is just some pattern of that divine force. And then the question becomes, do I trust God? Do I trust Guru? Do I trust Divine Mother? And interestingly, whenever you have anything that disturbs your peace of mind, if you're honest and you go deep enough, that is always the question. Do I trust God? Do I trust Divine Mother? Do I trust Guru? Do I believe that the form of what I'm experiencing is just the thinnest veil over their relationship to me? What do I feel about that relationship? And I realized that sincerely I hoped that the marriage that I had entered into would, be a positive experience for me on all the levels that I could list out. But my willingness to enter into it could not be based on my expectation of how it was supposed to be. The only solid basis for it was that God and Guru would give me exactly what I needed. Now, if you can feel that God and Guru will give you exactly what you need, why would we be afraid of anything? Why would we even want anything to be different? Why would we feel anxious about any circumstance that come to us? So there's a whole lot of different ways that we can develop psychological integration, competence in our profession, good communication techniques, creative learning strategies, and I favor all of them. Why not attack the problem on all levels? But in the final analysis, all fear, all lack of confidence is lack of confidence in our relationship with God. And the more powerfully we can solve every problem by as quickly as possible going there, the more we build in ourselves a kind of solution that then never allows these problems to really get a grip on us. Now, in order to trust God in that way, we have to completely redefine what it looks like when God loves us. I touched on that very briefly last night when the gentleman in the back of the room asked me about how can we get more good karma. Not all of you were here, and I didn't have the chance to answer it as strongly as I might have. But that question of what is good karma is directly related to our faith in God. Because in this world, Swami Kriyananda says, this planet at this time, just if we were in an early Dwapara Yuga on planet Earth, which is where we all are, you might have noticed we're all here, this planet is designed to please the ego, to please the body, and to think in terms that a good life is a life that's not too hard to live through. Now, inasmuch as one lifetime is such a tiny fragment of eternity, and our consciousness is eternal, to actually define a good life as one that doesn't plague us too much, and in which everybody around us also has an easy time, and that nobody is challenged too hard, we have to really ask ourselves if that is the proof that God loves us. If a mother is raising a child and her concept of that child is don't ever, ever, ever let anything challenge this child, let him never have any disappointments, let me never let him sort of go anywhere where anything might happen to him. What kind of a mother really is that? Who is the mother loving? And is it easy? It's not always easy to parent correctly. But we recognize that the child is given to us to raise into a strong and capable person, not to keep from discovering its own strengths. And the image of parents and children, everything in this world is a symbol. And we can learn so much from our tangible experience of parents and children, and that's why we think of God as a divine mother or as a heavenly father. That's how we always pray, because it's something we can understand, especially when we realize, of course, if God is our divine mother, then we are children being raised. And what are we being raised to be? Well, we're being raised to be the sons of God, in fact, which is to say, to have Christ consciousness. So the only purpose of this incarnation is for us to expand our consciousness step by step, which is what I was saying to the man last night. So the only thing we can really trust God to give us is the opportunity to do that. And yet when that opportunity comes, every so often we shrink from it, we're afraid of it, and we're mad at God for giving it to us. Isn't that odd? I've often written to my friends when something catastrophic happens to them, well, looks like Divine Mother is taking an unwelcome interest in your spiritual growth. Isn't that so? You didn't invite her, but she intruded herself in. And now you're having a chance to grow in ways you never wanted to grow. I mean, I'm just joking. But that is a lot of times how it feels, isn't it? Now, if we want to have courage and confidence in life, the only way that confidence will never leave us is if we have cultivated this relationship with the divine. And above all, this is a very interesting aspect of it. Let me come, I'll tell it from a different angle. I've mentioned to some of you that I first came to India in 1986, which is now a number of years ago. India, of course, has changed so much in these years. These have been the critical years. India was not open to foreign corporations when we first started, and of course that was the huge shift, a huge positive shift. As Swamiji puts it, I love the way he puts it, India is too great a country not to be able to take her place among the great nations of the world, and therefore it's necessary to go through this globalization, which is what's happening. But when we came in 1986, my husband David and two of our friends, Durga and Vidura, whom many of you know because they lived in Gurgaon for a few years, the four of us just, had this red-hot idea that it would be both really fun and also a reasonable sort of business proposition to bring American devotees to India and to take a pilgrimage in the footsteps of Master, which Daya and Keshava have taken up that tradition, and among other reasons why we don't do it anymore is because they and others now take it. So when we first started in 1986, and for over the course of 20 years, We came, I think, a dozen times. Not every year, but almost every other year. We brought, by the end, 30 to 40 Americans every time, so we brought quite a few people. Almost always, the whole trip was Americans. Almost always, they had never been to India or to any country that was not as highly developed as America or many of the European countries. The first trip that we came, I had never been to India. In fact, 3 of the 4 tour leaders had never been to India. My husband had come earlier, a few years earlier. He actually came while Ananda was still alive and saw her. And then he came over and planned the whole trip and then just basically gave the rest of us a clue and we set off. We had Indian travel guides and so on, but still. But there was a phenomenon that was a uniquely American phenomenon, which is the kind of poverty that you kind of live side by side with in this country simply doesn't exist in America. Or if it does, it's way out of sight from people who are not living that way. And so people had this enormous anxiety about the idea of beggars or people living on the sidewalks or just, the way the world works on this side, and it's just the way it is. And my job in the pilgrimage was to take care of the people and to talk to them about where we were, the same as what I always do. So Durga and I were a lot of times working with the emotional health of the group, and a pilgrimage is actually, it's not a vacation, it's a growth experience, so people go through changes. And one of the things that people would often have to go through was just coming to peace with seeing people living at very different levels of reality than they had ever seen or imagined before. And I began to sort of see a pattern, and it was a fascinating pattern to me. When we went to Calcutta, there were so many holy places in relation to Calcutta, and especially in the early years, there were very few middle-range hotels at that point. There were hotels that Americans were really uncomfortable, and there were 5-star hotels. And that 5-star hotels hadn't skyrocketed in their prices so much. So we would stay at the Oberoi Grand, which is a very gorgeous hotel. And often from your room, you could look down and you could watch families living on the sidewalk. We were there for a number of days because there are a lot of holy places. And so the people, our people in their rooms would get to know the families that lived on the sidewalks and they would watch their lives. People had such different reactions. Many people just almost became unhinged emotionally at the sight of the way people had to struggle sometimes to live. And I began to realize this was the key. It didn't really matter what your background or experience was. Some people, from their own experience, had come to understand that God often teaches me things I could not learn any other way by giving me very difficult circumstances. In other words, I learn through suffering. And therefore, when something is not going the way I want and I'm suffering, it's always a mixed reality, because even as I'm suffering, I'm conscious of the fact that through this process, my consciousness is going to expand and I'm going to get somewhere that I want to go. Other people were in a constant state of rebellion against the idea that bad things were good things. And they'd never come to an understanding of that. They were in rebellion, and that's the right word. They were in revolt against the way God was teaching them. They had not accepted the reality of life. And so when they were confronted with other individuals who were going through the necessary karmic stages that they had to go through to get from where they were to God realization eventually, all they could see was suffering. There wasn't a sense in it that behind every form is God and Guru and Divine Mother doing with us exactly what we need to have happen. And so the conversation, I realized, was not really about that family living on the sidewalk in Calcutta. It was about what is going on in your life that you're so upset about, that you're angry at God about, because that was always the source of it. And so, fear and anger get very close to each other. Resentment. In the Festival of Light, not Diwali, but the Festival of Light that we sometimes read through, I know you know it somewhat. In America, we read it every single Sunday, so if you come at all, it's memorized. But there's a portion in there which is an allegory about a little bird and how it goes through its stages. The first stage after we're manifested from the infinite, which represents the soul, is that God says you have a divine mission. You should be, quote, fruitful in the gifts that God has given you. You should expand and multiply them. And all that you acquire, you should share with all as we have shared with you. This is what the divine says to the emerging soul. But then the little bird starts flying around and it starts feeling really, like it's pretty hot stuff, and it's really enjoying the power that's flowing through it. And it begins to think, I don't think that advice about sharing is really very good. I think that where my happiness comes from is when I just pull it all in for me and keep it for me. In other words, I just puff up this little ego. And in the little Festival of Light, it says, and so the bird entered the second stage of the soul's long journey, which is called the revolt. And the revolt is, well, yeah, I know that this is the divine law, but I don't think so. I think I'm going to make up my own divine laws, and I'm just going to make my life work according to my concept, like this. And then it says there, and even though repeatedly the bird lost everything it had, it clung to this point of view. Until finally, it just gets battered around so much that it enters the third stage. And the third stage is not knowledge yet, but it becomes the quest for true understanding. And the quest for true understanding is the shift between, God, why are you doing this? To, God, why are you doing this? Completely different point of view. And we only get there by hard experience. And the fourth stage is when we know. That's when we're redeemed from all misunderstanding. That's the stage of the masters. But watching my friends cope with what appeared to them to be this, unbearable suffering of others was always an indication that they were in revolt against what God was asking of them. Now, if you're not, and revolt often comes really close, and I want to use the word, it comes close to fear. I can't cope with this. This is more than I can do. And whether it's my own suffering or the suffering of someone else, if you stop and think about it, it always comes down to a lack of faith in the fact that God's form, that whatever the form you're watching is really just a veil over God speaking to you and reaching you and guiding you. Now, even knowing that, it's not always easy. When my parents entered the last 5, 6, perhaps even 10 years of their life, I lived a few hundred miles away from them, but in the same state. And it was a very easy plane ride back and forth to where they lived. And even though I'm one of 3 children, a lot of the responsibility for them fell on me. And my mother had Parkinson's, and it's a very difficult disease. The last few years, my father's mind began to slip a little bit. So it was a little tough, especially managing it from a distance. And I began to wear a little thin, because sometimes I would have to fly back and forth like even twice a week. And plus I had all the responsibilities that I had. And it was a short flight, and travel's much easier in America than it is here, but still it was a lot. But what I really realized, and no matter how many years you're on the path, God sends you things and you get to learn something new until we're God realized, that I had a very hard time accepting their karma, and what I kept trying to do was change it. I thought if I was executive enough and organized enough and strong enough, that I could shift their karma somehow. But I also realized that their karma frightened me. I was frightened, and I actually realized, it was very odd, I was frightened for them. And I went through this extremely interesting process, which was extremely important for me. I realized in my own life that I'm not consciously afraid of my own karma now. I can't say that I'm fearless, that would be way overstating it. But I figure if God sends it to me, He'll send me the power to deal with it. And if it's supposed to come to me, whatever it might be, it's supposed to come to me, and therefore it'll be fine. At least in theory. I hesitate slightly because you never know what'll happen when you're really tested, but I'm solidly there. But I realized I didn't trust anybody else on the planet. I didn't trust my parents to be able to deal with their own karma. Do you see what I mean? It's like I can learn, I can be taught by God, but they can't. And I realized, oh my God, how insulting is that, first of all. And secondly, the situation they were in was exactly where they should be, because they had gotten there over the course of a whole lifetime, over many lifetimes, and the karma they were dealing with fit them exactly. It wasn't my karma, it was theirs. It didn't fit me, so it made me very nervous, but it fit them. Even my mother, 10 years into her 15 years of Parkinson, said to me over lunch one day in just this manner, "I hate to admit it," she said, "but this disease has been the making of me," just like that. And by then I had gone a long way, but I felt God was patting me on the head. So here's the prayer I shifted to. Instead of, help me out of this, Lord. I said, okay, Divine Mother, if you're going to test these people this way, you have to give them the receptivity, the wisdom, and the devotion to learn whatever it is you're trying to learn, to teach them. And it was, all of a sudden, I was not in revolt against what was going on. All of a sudden, I was in the quest. In a real sense, I don't know what they're supposed to learn. I'm not going to presume, but if it's what you want to send them, then we're going to work on this together. And the only way I know how to pray for this is you have to help them. I can't make my 85-year-old father into something that he is never going to be. I can't make my 85-year-old mother into something she's never going to be. But behind every form there is God and Guru. They had no faith particularly. They had no connection to my path. The best I ever got out of my mom, God bless her, toward the end of her life, sort of like this, she said. And I sort of turned my back a little because that's how she said it to me. I don't know. I just like having you around. Then she kind of looked off like this. Probably has something to do with what you've been doing. I thought, that's enough. I don't need more than that. But that was when I started, that was after I started actually helping them to grow instead of trying to make myself more comfortable by getting out of the whole situation. So whatever circumstance comes to us, we have to start by expanding the venue. This is not just a little situation, whether it's me alone or the people I love or someone who's come to me who just has a real challenge to meet. We have to expand the venue, and we just have to relax. We're all in this together, and God is in charge. There's just really nothing else going on here. And for ourselves, if we're serious about our spiritual growth and have the slightest belief in reincarnation, even a little bit, which most of you I'm sure have a great deal of that, but we can believe in reincarnation and not recognize the implications of it. There was a man in America whose name was Stephen Levine, and starting 30 or 40 years ago, he did a lot of work to help people understand the process of death a lot better than it was understood. And he used to run workshops for people who had terminal illnesses. And one of the exercises, I read this in the book that he wrote. I think the book he wrote is called Who Dies? It was published like 30 years ago. I don't even know if it's still in print. It was a very good book. And he got people together whose lives, from their point of view, were going to end prematurely. Of course, nobody's life ends prematurely because death happens at the moment that you're finished with this body. However early or late that comes in the cycle of your years, it ends when you're finished with the body, you take it off. And as long as it's serving you, you keep it on. And it's not something that the ego decides, it's the soul. But he would get these people together and he would have them first make a list of everything that they felt they were going to miss because their lives were going to be taken away from them as they saw it early. I'll miss my daughter's wedding, I won't see my grandchildren grow up, or if they were very young, I'll never get married, I won't finish college, whatever it might be, long list. And everybody would be very emotional. And then you would make another list. And this was all the things that you get to avoid having to face because you're going to get out of this body. I won't have to sort out my financial situation. I won't be there when the house is foreclosed upon. I won't lose my youthful figure, whatever it might be, the long list. And then actually, after all that was done, it was the list of things that you thought you got to avoid that actually was the focus of what they worked with. Because these are the things that we fear above all, that we don't feel we have the strength to face. Now, I thought that was a fascinating exercise, and I sort of, in my mind, just thought I would sort of just play out those lists. And what was most interesting to me, I couldn't put anything, or I really couldn't put anything on the stuff I'm going to be able to avoid list, because just taking off this body didn't mean I would get to avoid it. There was no belief in my mind that death was going to get me out of any karmic problem, that every karmic problem would have to be faced, and it would be now when I was facing it. Even if it's next incarnation, when it comes, it's going to be now. Now, that thought, which actually came to me many years ago, has given me a tremendous amount of perseverance and courage, whereas I used to be a lot more tender about things. Because I realized, if I don't do it now, I'm just going to have to do it tomorrow. And, well, this is a line from the Ramayana, when Rama was exiled, and his father begged him to stay one more night. And Rama replied, inevitable disappointment is not lessened by postponement. And I've always had that in my mind. Inevitable struggle is not lessened by just waiting till tomorrow. And in fact, even more, and this is sobering to realize, when a karmic wave hits us, what happens is the wave is bigger than our consciousness, actually. And so we tend to feel like we're being engulfed by that wave. But the opportunity of a karmic challenge is to expand our consciousness to be bigger than the wave of karma. And if we can, and this is the way Swami Kriyananda puts it, if we can meet the wave of karma at the crest and generate sufficient energy and faith in God in the moment, then we will have overcome it at that level of energy. We'll have neutralized the vritti at that level of energy. But most of the time what people do is the karmic wave is this big, our consciousness is this big, but gradually over time, no matter how intense it is, time passes and it seems smaller. So often we just hang out at the same size we are, and we just wait till it gets small enough that it squishes under us, and then we say, oh yeah, I've overcome that. But really, we haven't, because we still have a karmic wave that's this big to meet. So there's another factor of that. Not only are we dooming ourselves to need to rise to that, but the next time it comes, it'll look even bigger, because time will have passed and we won't have expanded in it, so we'll feel smaller in relationship to it. Okay? Now, these are very strong incentives for just realizing And you have to have this, the basis of this has to be, behind every form is God and Guru and Divine Mother helping us to grow into our inevitable destiny. In our school system, our Living Wisdom schools, which I know are Education for Life schools, which a lot of you know, we have our middle school, which is 12, 13, 14-year-olds. The woman who teaches the literature classes there, a very skilled teacher. She's also the director of our school. Her name is Helen Purcell. She actually came to India once, and I think to this area, to talk to other educators. She used to be a college professor, and then she got involved with us, and we didn't have a college then, so she works with younger children. But she still teaches, even the middle school, a lot of the same curriculum that she used to teach in college, of course appropriate. But the way it's been described to me by her co-teacher, which just as a coincidence is Brian's father, our cameraman back here, it's his dad, is that the children know that Helen will never ask of them something they can't do, and that she will never desert them until they've managed to master it. And I thought, isn't that just a perfect way to think about Divine Mother? That it may look like a lesson that's way beyond us, but she'll never ask of us something she doesn't believe we can do, and she will never desert us until we have learned how to do it. Now, these are things we have to practice before the tsunami of karma hits. Because when the tsunami comes, it's a little hard to remember which way is up. But if we simply, in every little thing that we're doing, especially in every little thing that we're doing, in every little reaction, whenever we begin to slide off of that confidence, just stop and pull your thoughts back. Why would I shy away from this? What makes me think that ease and pleasure is really a better solution than just facing into this? And what makes me think that just pushing it away today is going to keep it from returning tomorrow? It's just going to keep knocking at my door until I'm resolved. Swami Kriyananda often tells stories about how he goes to the dentist without taking any Novocaine, without taking any painkillers, and he has all this, really difficult dental work done without anything to mitigate the effect of it. The stories make me shudder even to hear them. And not only is he able to endure it, but he's able to sit still enough for the dentist to be able to do the work. I mean, I could imagine starting, but then I would be writhing so much under the dentist's tools that, he'd end up cutting my mouth to pieces. But Swami can just calmly sit there and let this happen. That's a whole story in itself. But for a long time I kept thinking, why does he keep telling us about going to the dentist? Why does he horrify us with these stories? And then I realized that anything that we fear is karma that still has to be worked out. That's one of the ways you can tell, what kind of karma do I have? Anything that frightens us. Because if we had complete faith in God, why would anything frighten us? So anything that frightens us is the list of the karma that we still have to face. Now, I'm afraid of physical pain. At least I certainly can't go and seek it out. I always take Novocaine when I go to the dentist. I can't imagine not doing it. But we don't really have many opportunities in which we actually have to face into physical pain unless it's been thrust upon us and then we have no choice. And I finally realized Swami's just using this as an example. Just because something is unpleasant doesn't mean we have to shy away from it. And anything that we fear, sooner or later has to be faced. And the sooner we face it, the less power it has over us. So it becomes sort of like courage becomes the coward's way out. Because if it's just going to get worse, let me just deal with it right now. I faced a very difficult period in my life when I had to write the book about Swami Kriyananda as we have known him. which I did successfully write it. Here it is. And just speaking of it, here it is. It's actually, it's a beautiful book because of the subject. It's the stories of many people's experience about him. I set out to write a biography and I just wasn't able to. But I realized that the story of his life is the effect that it's had on others. So this is a very good book. But I had a very hard time writing it. And I had complexes about writing from past lives, who knows why. But I just did. Phobic is actually the word. I was just phobic about it. And also I had a very, very, very critical mind, and all the criticism I had ever leveled at anybody, every time I'd type a sentence, I would criticize it. So I actually worked on the book for like almost 3 years and I had nothing. I'm not exaggerating. It wasn't like I had a bad manuscript. I had literally nothing, absolutely nothing. It was quite a period of time, and I'd put myself out there in a big way that I'm writing this book, and all these years passed and I had nothing. It was, spiritually, it was a fabulous experience, as I said to Swamiji, except for the fact that I don't have a book and I'm no closer now than I was 3 years ago. I've learned so much about myself, but I still had to succeed at the project. At some point he said to me, "It's just not working, why don't you quit?" Which was perfect psychology for me, because, I wanted an excuse to quit. And I stepped back for a minute and thought, well, if he gives me permission to quit, maybe I could quit. But he was working with me. But I said to myself, if I quit now, not only am I eventually going to have to face this, but this can go on for another incarnation. Like in my next incarnation, I'm just going to have to live through all this again. And what is the point? Just like, and I finally said, "Sir, I'll die trying." I have something to say, and I'm going to say it, and if I die trying, I will die trying. And I was ready to spend the rest of my life typing and deleting if I had to, because it was just going to come later. It was strange to me how that thought, instead of frightening me, actually gave me courage, and shortly after that I was able just to get over it in a certain way. And when I got over it, well, I'll speak specifically about writing. I got over it because I stopped thinking about myself and I started thinking about others. I started thinking about communicating, not who was communicating. And I got a clear picture of who I was talking to, and I knew I had something to tell them, and I just started telling them. And I decided even if I told it badly, it was worth telling. I put it in a different context. I'm just saying that specifically, but the real point of that story was just, if not now, when? And I said, it's been bad enough that I've battled this my whole life. I really don't want to see this karma again. And sometimes that's the best way to have courage in it. This is terrible right now, but we don't get out of things by doing them badly. That's something Swamiji said to me once. That was very discouraging. I thought, well, we'll just do it badly. I just won't really put good energy into this. I'll just do a really sloppy job because I don't really want to. And he said, you don't get out of karma by doing it badly. You get out of karma by just looking right at it, asking, God, what are you asking of me? And then you may not be successful in the eyes of the world, but if you have put your best energy right into it, then that's how you get through it. And you see, once you do that, the fear also goes away. Oh, I know, I was thinking about this other thing, and it is relevant. When I was in India quite a few years ago, after Swami moved to Gurgaon, we shifted our residence within our community, and there were all these windows, and I priced curtains in America, and I was breathless for quite some period of time. So when I came to India, I went to a shop in Gurgaon and I had all the dimensions of the windows, and I went home with all these gorgeous curtains, which I all have now, which cost me a fraction of what they would have cost me at home. Then I had to hang them all. And I'm not good with tools, let's put it that way. But for some goofy reason, I decided I would put all the curtain rods up myself. My husband kept saying to me, what are you doing? And so I did, and when you come to visit me, you'll see that a lot of them are a little tilted and some of them are falling off the walls. But for some reason it was very important for me to put all those curtain rods up myself, and this is why. because I couldn't do it. I didn't really know how to do it. I couldn't do it very well, and there was no hope of my doing it in an expert manner. But it was a simple challenge to my ability to persevere against a seemingly insurmountable obstacle. And in the course of putting up the curtain rods, I learned that all of life is the patient application of willpower. Just the patient application of willpower. I'd hang it, it was screwy. Well, screwy is not the right word, it was tilted. I'd have to pull it off. I learned to fill the holes, I learned to paint over the holes, I learned to do all these different things, you know, for an endless period of time. But I also realized that the patient application of willpower, it's a generic solution. And I learned it from the curtain rods. I don't think I could have learned it in any other circumstance because there was no emotional component. But ever since then, whenever fear strikes me and anxiety strikes me and how can I do this and I don't have time and this job is so far beyond me and everybody's upset, how am I going to do it? The patient application of willpower, just unrelenting, steady, solid movement. And you don't have to think then about the giant project and what happens if and how about them and all of the many, many things that just paralyze it. You just patiently put out willpower, step by step by step. And at the end of it, one of the things about writing this book that was so interesting to me, because it was stories, and so it suits my temperament because I can concentrate intensely for short periods of time. And so there were little stories, and I just wrote it, it would be done. I'd write it, and it would be done. But I was still frightened by the idea of writing a book. And I didn't know that you write a book one page at a time. I was so obsessed with the idea of writing a book that I didn't understand that you don't sit there and then you have a book. And it sounds like now it's so self-evident. But at the time I was so frightened that I didn't realize it was just the patient application of willpower. Just like that. I think I published the book before I hung up the curtain rods. I didn't know it. But I just wrote one page at a time, and then I looked around me and suddenly there was a book. But actually, the patient application of willpower, one page at a time, and suddenly there's a life. One of Master's marvelous phrases is, take care of the minutes, and the incarnations will take care of themselves. That's really almost impossible to comprehend, but it's true. Because a whole lifetime is just the choices that you made minute by minute. And don't worry about being afraid. Everybody's afraid. Courage is to do what you need to do, whether you're afraid or not. And that's a very, very important distinction. I used to think courage was the absence of fear. It's not. It's the ability to act regardless of the fear. And acting with that, with the awareness that everything that comes to me is God and Guru in some disguise or another, and they will not ask anything of you that they don't know you have the capability to do, and they will not desert you until you have succeeded. And from that, everything can happen. So, questions, thoughts, comments?
I have an observation there.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not a question, but an observation.
Comments, that falls in the category of comments, I'll take that. Mm-hmm.
So, see what happens is, after listening to you, I realized, the challenges which we face are what you termed as, the unwelcome spiritual growth, which the God tries to give it to us.
Yes.
But the way we have been brought up, the message which we get, and it's not I'm saying from our parents, but from the religions or the temples or the mosque, wherever we go, is whatever challenges we are getting from something evil, and actually the God is there to help us out. If we pay this much of money or do these many prayers or do these many chants, we'll be able to come out of that, or we'll be able to avoid those challenges. And coming to the second point which you talked about, the revolt comes actually maybe because of this, that we have done all these things which were prescribed, but still now these things why these things are coming to us.
Well, actually, that is a question, and it's a very good question. The answer to it is pure teaching gradually gets corrupted over time by lesser consciousness, lesser individuals, sometimes even self-seeking, corrupt individuals, but let's pretend that just people of sincere intention who don't really understand what the true teaching is, they just keep bringing it down to something that makes more sense to them. And then pretty soon you have a complete distortion, and then a new avatar comes. And every time a new avatar comes, I mean, they say when virtue declines and vice predominates, but another way of saying that is when the purity of the teachings has been diluted by too many intervening generations of unrealized masters, we just have to come in and fix it. Speaking of what you're saying about the Hindu tradition, which is really what you're talking about, when I came to Ananda at the age of 22, 24 was when I moved, and just as an American girl, Swami Kriyananda was closer to his time in India, and we were living a very, very isolated life at that point. We had one ashram, and it was up in the hills. It still is up in the hills, but it was even more isolated. There's even 2 sections to that ashram, and we started in the most remote section. It was 6 miles, 3 miles back on a terrible road. We had no electricity. We didn't want radio or television, but we couldn't have had it anyway. That was long before the internet or email. No phones, no electricity, no radio, no television. And we just kind of created our own little universe up there. And Swamiji often wore Indian garb. We did a lot of Indian chanting, and we wore Indian garb, and we had Indian names. And we just played out, to my mind, as I look at it now, this little fantasy sort of life, of what we imagined. We'd never been to India. We had hardly ever met anyone from India, and we were just sort of like this. And we had a total fun time. It was just heaven on earth. We had so much fun. And, we got a little more in touch with the world after that. And actually, Swamiji westernized a bit because Master didn't try to impose Indian culture on Americans. So when we started reaching out to the world a little bit, we westernized a little. But I still thought that what we were being taught was Hinduism. I don't know, it came from India, why not? So it wasn't until 1986, which was quite a long time later, when I actually came to India. And I knew Christianity, even though I was raised Jewish. I still knew Christianity because it's a Christian country. I knew Catholicism. By then I'd really studied the Bible. And I came to India, and when I actually went around to the temples and began to be part of the ceremonies and things, I realized that what he taught, really, with all due respect, has nothing to do with Hinduism, or to put it differently, it's about as Hindu as it is Catholic. And it's certainly not Catholic, but it's about as Hindu as it is Catholic, which is there's a thread here and a thread here, but he didn't draw threads of Hinduism and threads of Catholicism. Jesus and Krishna, as the inspiring forces of our age, basically those religions pulled some threads of their teaching and are still holding it, but have also just coated with just huge, let's call them well-meaning, just stuff that got stuck on there during Kali Yuga, and he's gone back to the source and just pulling out something completely different. So, just as Westerners have to unburden themselves with our particular burdens, so all of you have to repudiate the things that you have just absorbed as true, but now that you examine them, are simply no longer valid. And when you get deeper into Master's expression of self-realization, if that's the path you're following, or even if you're not following this path, it's still an extremely edifying path. And then you can kind of look back at those traditions and you can kind of see where they came from. And you can feel more what was actually true and what is a false imposition on it. And it gives you a tremendous amount of confidence to just take or not take. But repeatedly, you have to notice when your mind is just falling back there. I mean, how convenient is it? Oh, you're having a problem? For 100 rupees I can fix it, you know. And then, or if we say these mantras, you see, it starts with truth. Okay, we'll do these mantras. Mantras have power. Let's say a genuine pujari, I really have power. I can direct power through this mantra and help literally dissolve the karmic pattern within you. That's the truth. But then it gradually just becomes, you pay this money, you do this ritual, this is supposed to happen, but there's no power anywhere in there. There's just form. There's no power. It's no longer self-realization. The Catholics, if you get these rituals, if you do this, if you go to Mass, if you get the priest to bless you, then you'll be saved. But there's no power there. Yogananda speaks of the Catholic practice of confession, where the priest absolves you of your sins. And he has the nerve to say it, I couldn't. He said, go to the priest with the stomach ache from the sin of overeating and see if he can cure it. Yeah, no, he just said it like it was. Yeah, how presumptuous. But of course, a saint can actually shift your karma. So when you meet a saint, you realize, oh, that's what they were trying to say. But it just became institutionalized. Fair enough? We all have a struggle. We all have to struggle because this is a new expression. This is not business as usual. This isn't just one more avatar. This is the beginning of Dwapara Yuga. This is a spiritual revolution. And it's very important for us as disciples, respectfully, but definitely, to understand what we have been given. And then otherwise we won't work with it appropriately. Otherwise we'll try to pull it into where we already are instead of taking ourselves into where it's trying to take us. So, yes?
You said that every thought gives a karma.
Uh-huh.
So one thought process goes on. Then I feel that process is wrong. And then I retrieve that process.
Uh-huh.
So still it carries the karma.
Well,
I say doing this thing is wrong. Then I say sorry or I retrieve it. Still...
Okay, what you have to understand, this is the question of if every thought creates a karma and I think the wrong thing and then I repudiate it, what's the net result? What you have to understand, and Harish was bringing this up earlier, about physics and spirituality and how close together they are, and in that conversation I said, I'm not a scientist, but I'll put it in these terms. Karma is a mathematical law. It's metaphysics. The word metaphysics is a good word there. It's like if you put a tremendous amount of energy out, then you have made a very strong implant. If you put a small amount of energy out, then the magnetism, the total energy field that you've created is obviously less. If you commit yourself, but immediately realize that was the wrong thing, and then with equal force repudiate it, then mathematically speaking, or energy to energy, it's an obvious balance. This is not like some government system that's being imposed on us, and we have to pay bribes to have it come out right. It's energy. It's completely honest, because it's completely impersonal. And even more profoundly, which is very important, the deepest reality is created by the intention of the heart. Because as Swamiji once put to me, you just can't always control what happens. Because you may have a very good intention and people may totally misunderstand you, and a whole cascading series of disasters may happen from something that you actually intended in a good way. Swamiji says it's the intention of the heart is where the karma is registered. And even if you accidentally cause a huge problem after that, if you stop on the road to remove a rock because you're afraid it's going to give somebody a flat tire, and then you're rear-ended and your car shoots into another car and that shoots into another car, all you really did was try to help. And that's really the karma that you get. So everything that you do, it's an energy reality. The more forcefully you do it, the more karmic power is created. So if you make a bad mistake, then take it back with as much energy as you can and trust that it all comes out correctly. That's a very important point because people get very confused and think that karma is like this completely inexplicable reality, like monkeys in the trees that are just going to jump on you at any moment and you have absolutely no, you're helpless in the face of it. Not at all. It's the cumulative force, the cumulative power of the energy that you have put out, and if you simply start putting out a comparable energy in another direction, then gradually it will shift. If you're going down one of these highways here, you know, the traffic system here is a little hard for me to comprehend, and when we left the airport, pardon?
Like some karma.
Yeah, we left the airport and Daya was not remembering that she lives here and was heading back to Gorgaon because we were just talking and we weren't paying attention. But when she noticed that, we were already sucked into some big system, and it took us quite a while of going in exactly the opposite direction that we wanted to go before there was access to be able to turn around and just get us all the way back. But she made the decision, even before we had entered that channel, that what we were doing was wrong. But nonetheless, there was momentum and there were circumstances, and we couldn't extricate ourselves for a long time. But eventually we made this big circle and we got back. So karmically, we may decide that we want to go in another direction, but there's momentum in circumstances, and sometimes it takes a while before we can make the big loop backwards. So merely realizing, even then, that we were going the opposite direction from where we wanted to go, it took time to turn the ship. And so with our own karmic conditions, as much energy as has been committed in a certain direction, we have to eventually put out enough energy in the opposite direction before we really see the change. Now theoretically, because we are infinite in our true potential, we should be able to reverse the karma in an instant. But we would have to put out as much energy in the new direction as we've already set in motion in the old. And this is where a saint can do that. He can just take the karma out of you by putting so much energy into you that the whole pattern is dissolved. And every so often the grace of God comes down and that does happen. But usually it takes us a little while to reverse the direction. But once we have that thought in our mind, we were definitely going to get here eventually. There was no doubt we would arrive here, and we did. But it took a little bit of doing.
If somebody shout at us, we feel little bad.
Yes.
It forms a karma.
It forms a karma of the magnitude of exactly as much energy as you've put in it. If on a scale of 1 to 10, you feel bad at the level of 4, then you have a 4. If you feel bad at the level of 27, then it's a bigger karma to get over. So you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be as non-terrible as you can be. Okay? And that's good though. It was kind of bad, but it could have been worse. I only put a 2 in instead of a 12. And that's very real. That's huge. Think of the difference. Yeah. Okay. I would take one more and then we're done.
So in case nobody is asking, then I'll take this off. Okay, so my question is, like you have told us, in case God gives us challenge and we should accept it happily and, we should be doing whatever to overcome that challenge.
Mm-hmm.
But my curiosity is on the other side. So what should one make out of it if the God is not giving you a challenge? Is it there something bigger waiting for to fall on you, or what should one do about it?
I know. Here's actually what one should do about it. Yeah. Well, see, the Catholics think if you're not suffering, God doesn't love you, and that's one of their big mistakes. Jesus actually resurrected, and the image of Christianity could have been Jesus resurrected. Instead, it's Jesus crucified, which, it's just a really gruesome, horrible picture. And the whole point of that was that he resurrected. We didn't have to see him suffering. We could have seen him overcome. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. This This is my way of thinking of this. The purpose of our incarnation is to keep moving expansively with all our energy into the light. Ideally, we should run toward the light because it's so beautiful and it gives us such joy, we're just rushing toward it. But if we don't do that, we will catch fire from the back. Okay? So if you're not on fire from the back, the response is, you better keep running forward. Because otherwise, if you try to take it easy, you'll catch fire. But if you're moving, there's no need for you to catch fire. You see? Okay, I think that's the ending point. Thank you all very much. God bless you. What do you... Di is making motions back there. What was the motion?
I was pointing to Casey.
Oh, okay.
If you're done, Asha.
I think I'm finished. I was going to say that I'm happy to answer questions after we're finished here. I honor time very religiously. So
if you could end with prayer and then Casey will make an
okay,
announcement.
I'll end with a prayer and then Keisha will make an announcement. That's a great plan, Daya. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda. Thank you for the blessing of bringing us together to enjoy your presence in one another and within ourselves. We are your children. Awaken us in your light. Om Shanti Shanti.